I know. I like a couple of times I have forgotten to start the recording and then like 20 minutes in realize it's not going. Yeah, that's never a good feeling.
I've only done that once and I got all the way to the end and it was on Skype. It was not through my platform. And I thought I hit record, but it was on pause the whole time. So anyway, we're recording, so we're good.
All right.
All right. Well, welcome to the podcast, Mike. So happy to have you here. We are starting another episode of Fast to Heal Stories and so delighted to have you here. So I hope that you are up for me picking your brain over the next hour.
Yeah, I can't wait. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. It's always fascinating to get other perspectives on all of the things that we talk about on the podcast. So I know I was introduced to you through Chris Irvin, who's going to be on the podcast in a few weeks as well. And so he was a big fan of yours. I'm like, yeah, let's bring him on and pick his brain for a little bit. So very excited to have you here, but tell us who you are, where you got to today. I know you were trained in the conventional medical system. Like I was trained in the conventional dietetics system, and both of us were like, there's better ways to do things. So tell us how you got here.
Yeah, so just as you mentioned, so I'm a physician trained in the traditional medical system. Actually worked in the traditional medical system for about a little over 10 years. So I trained in South Carolina, and then I did my residency in emergency medicine in Utah actually, and worked in emergency medicine for 7 years in Utah in academics, where I was like, writing papers and, submitting grants and teaching residents and doing the very like standard academic thing of research and all that stuff and taking care of patients, of course. But um, that's when I first started to get a little itchy. I get that itch that like this just doesn't something doesn't feel right. And ended up going into the community to see if that fixed things, and turns out didn't. Still had the itch, and that itch was really just sort of an inherent frustration into the way our healthcare system is designed and the way that we try to take care of patients, which is very reactive. I think people talk a lot about preventative medicine in traditional healthcare, but the system isn't designed so that you can actually enact preventative medicine, because you don't get paid basically to prevent people from getting disease. You get paid when people have disease, and that inherent issue makes preventative medicine almost like untenable for our traditional healthcare system. So realizing that, and seeing on a day-to-day basis these people who are at the end of their disease course in the emergency department, who knowing that, if somebody had gotten hold of them, 20, 30 years ago, this would be a totally different story, right? These people might not have diabetes, they might not have heart disease, they might not have, early dementia. And realizing that, I sort of came to this realization simultaneously as also starting to have some of these realizations about my own health. So I was a physician in good health, exercising all the time, taking care of myself, and when just got my blood checked for like a regular physical, and my lipids were insanely high, just like ridiculously high. And so what I did was I went on a diet to try to reduce my lipids, and it didn't work. They got twice as bad. And this is a diet. There's multiple publications showing that you can reduce your lipids going on this diet, and it didn't work. In fact, it made them worse. My LDL cholesterol was over 300. My total cholesterol was like, unmeasurably high. LDL particle number size was unmeasurable. It was so high. They said that, they mentioned this sometimes when they're checking blood. They held the serum up to the light, and you could actually see the fat in the serum.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, it
Anomaly.
wasn't working out great for me. I had an inflammatory marker, CRP was elevated, all these things. So around that time, I had also sort of started delving into the idea of genetics and using genetics to help predict how people are going to respond to certain things, certain environmental factors. And my partner, Matt Dawson, who started Wild Health with me, he and I were very similar in sort of the way we lived our lives, the exercise that we did, the diets that we ate, things like that. And we both did these genetic tests at the same time, and ours were like diametrically opposed. And what was interesting was, he and I were actually on the same diet because we were just kind of trying it out to see if it would work. And his numbers all got better. but mine all got worse. And then looking at our genetics, we realized, oh, there's actually like these, like 10 different SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms that I have that he doesn't have that actually help explain that. And then sort of this is like an aha moment, like a light bulb went off. It's like, oh, okay, so if we just know these things about people, then all of a sudden we don't have to actually do this like constant testing and reiteration. We can actually like make predictions as to how people are going to respond to different environmental factors. And that was the beginning of Wild Health and the beginning of this idea of genomics-based precision medicine, at least for us. So we started, learning more about it ourselves, testing it on friends and family, and then next thing we knew, we started a company called Wild Health, which basically creates these lifestyle plans and works with patients using their genetics and lots of blood testing to get a better understanding of how they're going to respond to differences in their diet, in their nutrition, in their exercise, and sleep, all these different ways that we can actually make predictions and help give people a better plan on how to live their life, rather than just like willy-nilly saying, oh, I think keto is going to be perfect for me, or I think Mediterranean diet is the way to go. Like, we really don't know these things unless we look at the actual data to actually make a statement like that. So that's how we got started with Wild Health. And then next thing I know, we've got 90 employees, and we're a national telemedicine company, and that's where we're at. That's how I got here today.
That's fantastic. I can totally correlate with your story. It must be something about that 10-year mark, because that was about the time where I was like, like none of my patients or clients are getting better. They're having to go on more insulin. They're having to go on more medications. And then I was starting to have my own health issues as well. And then it was about 15 years and I'm like, can't do this anymore. I gotta get out of this and teach something completely different concepts than what I'm doing right now. So yeah, it's really hard to take a step back and say, what I'm doing, what I'm teaching isn't working. Like, there's got to be something else. And, there's a lot of pushback from a lot of the medical community that I'm sure that you saw as well. And it's hard to go against the grain. So I commend you for starting the company and finding specific tailored treatments for different people. And I'm like you, like, I don't like to call myself like the ketogenic nutritionist or the paleo nutritionist. I do identify with low carb because I think everybody can do well with lower carb than what the standard American diet is. But I don't like to put labels on people. And even when they enter my programs, they're always like, oh, you're going to put me on the ketogenic diet. It's like, well, no, that's not for everybody. Let's take a look at your goals. Let's take a look at your past medical history. Let's take a look at what you're doing now, because I can't, give you some sort of protocol that is going to be very difficult for you to follow due to your lifestyle right now. So yes, I love that your company is specific and tailored. So let's talk a little bit about like what you do. Like if somebody wanted to come and use Wild Health and or sign up as a client or a patient. I'm not sure what you call them, but I know that there's a process that they go through. So tell us what that looks like, and then we'll get into a little bit of some different specific topics.
Totally. So it's pretty easy. It's all telemedicine. So, it's all video conferencing. You go onto wildhealth.com, and then there's a join now button. Basically, you sign up for that, and people can either do like a one-time visit, or they can set up for a subscription. And we combine physician interaction and health coaching interaction, because we believe that just that one-time visit with the physician is usually not enough to enact behavior change. And we believe pretty strongly that in order to have meaningful health outcomes, there's going to have to be behavior change. Otherwise, it's prescriptions or something else that's just a Band-Aid. But to really change people's lives, they have to change the way they live their lives. And for that, health coaches can be really, really helpful. So people sign up for a subscription or for that one-time visit. They get a saliva kit sent to their house, and that tests for their DNA. We use a company called LabCorp that runs the DNA for us. And then we send them a requisition for a pretty large blood panel that we get at a pretty amazing discount from LabCorp. It's about 60 different blood markers, And that gives us an idea of like their hormone status, their electrolytes, their organ function, their risk for cardiovascular disease, minerals, all those things. And sometimes we have to expand that as well, but it's a really good starting point, and it's way more than you would ever get from a standard physician visit. I mean, this is looking at insulin and hemoglobin A1C and LDLP and ApoB and like all these things that you hear about on these podcasts that are important markers for health beyond the standard lipid panel that you would get from a physician. So you get those two things, and then that data comes back, and then we run it through an algorithm that we created because the genome's really very large. So that we're looking at like 800,000 different SNPs or single nucleotide
Wow.
polymorphisms, which means that, we're looking at a lot of different genes, and it's impossible to look at it with the human eye in any reasonable amount of time and figure out, what this person needs to do. So we realized pretty quickly that not only do we need to be looking at multiple SNPs, meaning polygenic. So you're looking at not just one SNP that affects cardiovascular disease, but let's look at the 27 different SNPs that we know affect cardiovascular disease. So combining all those things, we really had to get some tech involved. So we created an EMR called Clarity that runs an algorithm for us and gives us a lot of that information and helps sort of like speed up the process of understanding a person's genetics. And then the patient meets with, or the client meets with a health coach, kind of talk about your life, talk about like, what do you currently eat? How do you exercise? How's your sleep? Down and dirty details about it as much as possible about you. Like we want to know everything about the patient. And then after that, the health coach and physician kind of meet, go over all the data and everything. And then they meet with the patient for about an hour. We sit down and get, the physician also needs to get lots of information from the patient. And it's really more of a discussion than it is like a presentation of your health. It's like, let's talk about what we found, but let's also talk about you and what you're interested in, or what makes you happy, and what your goals are. Like those are all as important as what your genetics and your labs say, right? So, just because the genetics and labs tell me that you're going to do great on a ketogenic diet doesn't mean I'm going to put you on a ketogenic diet, because you might tell me like, hey, I'm vegan and I don't want to eat nothing but olive oil all day. So, in that case, like, cool, we'll figure out a different diet for you. So it really is a conversation where the health coach, physician, and the client meet together and sort of form this like three-legged stool, right? Without each one of those people engaged in the conversation, you're not going to have a successful visit. So we work with people to create sort of a life plan with them, and in that we deliver a health report to them that is about 50 pages long, that goes over everything from macronutrients, micronutrients, methylation, exercise, minerals and micronutrients, cardiovascular disease, dementia, insulin resistance, sleep, neurobehavioral, and then longevity. So we try to cover each one of those areas in as much depth as possible as we can in that hour. And often people end up doing sort of the, come back again for another visit, because it's hard to get through all that stuff in 1 hour, obviously.
Yeah, that's very comprehensive. But all of those different areas are so important, because sometimes people might get a genetic test and they see the different SNPs and they're like, oh, I'm a bad methylator. I have to take B vitamins all day long, but they don't look at the other components like the blood testing and that, or like you said, they might just be eating the wrong diet for them. And I can't tell you how many clients and I've heard you speak on other podcasts, like people always want to ask me what I eat every day and what I feel good on. And I do help with that. I post what I eat, but other than you eating whole real foods, it's got to be so much, it's different for every single person. And I can tell you exactly what I eat in a day and what makes my body feel good, but you might feel terrible eating that way. So I love that all of those three components are together, and the lab testing that, like you said, that is involved is crazy. I mean, crazy good, because, sometimes you go and you get a thyroid panel done and the doctor's just running TSH and they say, oh, that's elevated or low. And you think you have all these thyroid issues that really TSH isn't telling you enough. So, and I love that you have the health coaching available too, because it's one thing to get the data, but then to know how to interpret it is a totally another area to look into. So, yeah, that sounds awesome and very comprehensive. And nice that you have the follow-up, because a lot of it is just the follow-up and the accountability piece for people too. It's like they have all the knowledge in the world, they know it works, but to have that accountability is super helpful. So I'd like to ask you a little bit. This podcast is a lot about intermittent fasting and timed eating, and we do talk about therapeutic carb restriction. We talk a lot about insulin resistance. So I'd love for you to explain. I know sometimes when we're in this world where we're talking about these things every single day, talk about metabolic flexibility for us a little bit, because I was interviewing somebody a couple months ago, one of my clients who did really well, and we were talking about these things, and he stopped and he said, "Can you just tell me what does it even mean? Like, I hear people say, it's good to be insulin sensitive. It's not good to be insulin resistant. Like, what does that even mean?" And I was like, I'm so sorry. Like, sometimes you just think people know these things. So talk to us about what it means to be metabolically flexible and how important that is.
Totally. So in its most simple form, being metabolically flexible means that your body can use multiple different sources of calories with some degree of efficiency, right? So metabolic flexibility would mean that I could spend a day eating nothing but fats and not feel terrible from it, right? People talk about like keto flu, for example. So that's sort of the sensation of feeling crappy when you first move to a ketogenic diet. And that's because most people who are doing that don't have metabolic flexibility. They're not used to eating nothing but fats. They're not used to their brain working off nothing but ketones and not having the amount of sugar that you typically have on a regular basis. So that flexibility is just your body's ability to do it. Now, there's a physiologic reason that actually happens. So your body responds to its environment, and each cell has to produce specific proteins based on what you're giving that cell. So if I'm feeding that cell nothing but carbohydrates, it's going to produce the proteins that eat carbohydrates, right? The ones that use the carbohydrates for fuel. Whereas if I'm giving it fats, it's going to produce the proteins that use fats for fuel. But if I'm only doing one of those, I'm not creating all the different proteins. So my cells aren't prepared basically for this type of energy that I'm trying to give it. Metabolic flexibility is where basically your cells are used to having a variety of different calorie sources, and because of that, they produce the different proteins that they need within the cell to eat those different calorie sources. So metabolic flexibility is extremely important for not just feeling good, but also for your cells to be able to use those nutrients that you give it. So the reason I like metabolic flexibility is one of the reasons I like fasting so much. Whether it's time restricted feeding, whether it's intermittent fasting, whether it's extended periods of fasting, it's a great way to train your body to use ketones and to use fats as a source of energy rather than just constantly feeding it new carbohydrates every 2, 3, 4 hours, which so many people do. So that's how I think about metabolic flexibility. Yeah.
That's a great explanation, and totally different how I explained it. So I'm glad that I asked you about that. Yes. And of course, there's that study that was done prior to COVID showing that 88% of the American population is not metabolically flexible. And it's got to be way worse than that at this point in the last 3 years. So yes, I would say probably upwards of 90% or higher of people are not metabolically flexible, meaning they cannot burn different types of fuels efficiently. So yeah, we have some work to do for sure. So what are your thoughts on intermittent fasting as we're talked about that? With not only metabolic flexibility, but using it as a tool. For me, for clients who come and work with me, they're mostly coming to me for weight loss. Like that's always, and I give them some sort of protocol or we're meeting for personalized sessions. 95% of the time I have them list their top 3 goals, and weight loss is always in there, whether it's 1, 2, or 3. So how does intermittent fasting or timed eating, they're different, but how does that play a role with, we'll go the weight loss route, but why do you think it's important for people to adapt that? And, how do you go about, or do you have any sort of way that you figure out, where people should be starting with that and what their goals should be? Or is it just really personal from person to person?
Yeah, so we can talk specifically about weight loss, but I do think there, just to put it out there first, I do think there's other advantages to time restricted feeding and intermittent fasting beyond weight loss. So maybe we can dive into those after. As far as weight loss goes, intermittent fasting is a very convenient way to force the body to use its own energy sources for energy during a period of time during the day. It's also a convenient way to actually see a caloric restriction. So weight loss happens through caloric restriction, whether it's basically calories in versus calories out. Like that, it's impossible for that not to be the equation. Now, it's not as simple as just calories in, and there's also a metabolism has an effect there as well. So if you eat the same number of calories every single day and do the same amount of exercise, but then your metabolism starts to dive off, then you're going to see weight gain as opposed to continued weight loss. But in any case, I really like intermittent fasting, time restricted feeding for that sort of initial introduction to metabolic flexibility for people. Because it starts to train that metabolic flexibility that otherwise you'll see people get like tons of cravings as they're starting on a new diet where they're actually restricting calories. Intermittent fasting is a nice way to sort of start to train them before you start calorie restriction or increase an exercise program or something like that. We've also seen that intermittent fasting can, have effects on metabolism and the speed of your metabolism as well. So, if you're keeping your calories about the same, you might actually see an improvement in your metabolism if you're cramming those calories into a shorter period of the day, as opposed to expanding them out throughout the entire day. Beyond that, in order to lose weight, you have to actually get in what's called a catabolic state, and that's when your body starts, basically eating fat, your fat stores, instead of depending on these calories from your diet. And you put yourself in a catabolic state more regularly when you're intermittent fasting, as opposed to when you're eating on a regular basis. And then if you're eating on a regular basis, your cells are thinking, "Hey, I'm getting all this food. I'm just going to keep growing. I'm going to divide. I'm going to make some more cells." But in reality, what we wanted to do is actually we want the cells to eat themselves or to eat fat, as opposed to building. So we're trying to move from that anabolic state to a catabolic state. And then there's the effect on insulin. So intermittent fasting basically increases insulin sensitivity, meaning that your cells are going to respond better to insulin. Now, insulin is basically a growth hormone. It's got an anabolic effects. It tells the cells to use certain use certain energy stores as opposed to fat. So it actually turns off fat utilization as a source of energy. So the more we have lower levels of insulin in our body, the more likely we are to eat our own fat as opposed to building up more cells. So that's sort of how I think about it from a weight loss standpoint. I typically have people start off pretty slow, to be honest. I'm not like, straight to like a, 18-6 sort of guy or anything like that. I typically start with like, let's just get 12, let's see
Right.
what 12 feels like, because, you talk to people and you realize like, people eat something before they go to bed and then
The
they eat something
stretch,
before
yeah.
they wake up. I mean, it's like when you stop eating midnight, when you start eating 7 a.m. It's like,
I
whoa,
know,
okay.
it's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah, so it's a lot of eating. So like, let's just get 12. And if you look at the research, a lot of the anti-cancer properties, while they might be there, it's possible that it's a linear relationship. At around 12, 13 hours is when we see a reduction in cancer from intermittent fasting. So start with 12, push to 14, get to 16, and then it really depends on the patient as to how far I'm going to push them. Some people, I'll just have them stick at 12 and then we'll do a 3-day fast, once a month, or if they're really trying to lose a lot of weight, maybe every 2 weeks or something like that. Whereas some people who, they feel great on intermittent fasting, they don't get tired. They feel awesome. They feel like they can they feel like they can fill themselves up in the afternoon, evening when they have their feeding window. And, those people will push to 18, 20 hours a day, something like that, and not do as many extended 3-day fasts. So it's really person to person dependent. Also depends a little bit on, how much are they exercising? Are they an athlete? Are they, a premenopausal female? Like those things all typically play into, who's going to feel better on certain fasting regimens.
Yeah, fasting can be really tricky. And I mean, I work with clients every single day, but it really is like sometimes 12 hours is a stretch. And like, okay, let's just do 12 to 14 hours over the next month, like get you used to,
Yeah.
used to
Yep.
that amount. And some other people are like, I do 20 every single day and I'm not seeing results. And they just need to really switch things up, or they need to move from more of a maintenance plan to a weight loss plan. But yes, everybody is so different. Like some people will lose, like my sister-in-law did 18-6 for a year and lost 50 pounds. And she basically did the same thing every single day, where other people will do that and see no change whatsoever. So it's very personal. And you just think, oh, I just have to, stop eating here and start eating here. But it can get really tricky from person to person, and very frustrating too, because you're not seeing the results that your family member or your friend or whoever kind of turned you on to it. So yeah, I definitely have much of the same approach. So I would love to ask you, we've talked a lot about insulin resistance on the podcast, and a lot about prediabetes and diabetes, and a little bit about fatty liver and all of the diseases that really kind of start with insulin resistance. They're starting in the muscle, they're starting in the liver, but we haven't really talked about the correlation between insulin resistance and blood pressure. And so many people, my dad's had high blood pressure for probably 20 years, think it's a salt thing. Like, oh, I can't eat a lot of salt, I need to reduce my salt. But yet they'll go and they'll eat all of the sugary, crappy food and think that has nothing to do with their blood pressure. And my clients who come to me for either weight loss or prediabetes or whatever, if they have high blood pressure, they're like, oh my gosh, my blood pressure is getting better. I'm like, yeah, you need to like work with your physician and make sure that they're monitoring those blood pressure medications, because it can really see changes really quickly. So I'd love for you to explain the correlation between insulin resistance and blood pressure, and why starting to resolve that insulin resistance will start to resolve blood pressure issues as well, because people just aren't really connecting the dots there.
Totally. So insulin is a hormone. It's released by the pancreas when you eat carbohydrates for the most part. You get a little bit when you eat protein, and virtually none when you eat fats. But the more carbs you eat, the more insulin's going to be running through your body. Now, in a normal person who doesn't have insulin resistance, who's insulin sensitive, that insulin runs through your veins, connects to your muscle cells, and says, "Hey, there's blood sugar in these blood. Why don't you take up some of this blood sugar?" Over time, the more you fill up those cells with sugar, that insulin doesn't work as well at the receptor that it attaches to in the cell. And you have to basically, your pancreas has to create more insulin in order to get the body to use up the sugar that's running through your blood vessels. So over time, we see an increase in insulin in the blood levels, right? And that is insulin resistance, where the cells don't respond to the insulin as well. Insulin is, like I mentioned, a hormone, and it has multiple effects outside of just telling cells to take up blood sugar. And one of its effects is actually at the level of the endothelium. So endothelium is the layer of blood cells that is on the inner lining of your blood vessels. And these blood cells are, basically a lining of cells that have receptors on them. And based on what's inside the vessels, they get to decide whether they increase or decrease in size. So those blood vessels obviously have to expand and decrease. And this is what determines your blood pressure. If your blood vessels contract and constrict, then you're going to have a higher blood pressure. If they expand, then you're going to have a lower blood pressure, just because basically volume of blood running around your vessels. Insulin will actually affect that endothelial lining of your cells so that they don't respond as well to whether it's other neurotransmitters, or whether it's other things running through your blood, or the fact that it's cold outside or it's hot outside. Those cells just don't work as well, and you get what's called kind of rigid arteries and veins, and that will lead to hypertension. So insulin has a direct effect on the endothelium, causing something called endothelial dysfunction, basically, where these cells don't function as well. The vessels can't relax and expand as well. They can't contract when they need to as well. And that leads to blood pressure over time. And lots of other things can cause this as well. But insulin resistance and prediabetes and diabetes is probably the number one cause now of hypertension that we see, now that smoking has had its decrease, because insulin is having a similar effect as cigarette smoke has on the lining of your arteries. But since we've seen a decrease in smoking now, we're seeing hypertension all over the place, obviously. And a lot of it is from insulin resistance, which comes from that higher levels of insulin, which is basically too much food, too often, and too much sugar. That's the three main problems we've got.
Well, you explain that much better than I would have. So I'm glad I asked you about it. You bring up an interesting point about cigarette smoke. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole or anything, but the new thing now is vaping, and I am just not up to date with that at all. I mean, I know a little bit about it. I have teenagers in the house, and I hear about how people are, kids are vaping in the bathroom and they don't even want to go in the bathroom. But other than that, does vaping have the same effect on blood pressure, or is it something about the cigarettes that, or are you not sure about that?
We don't know for sure yet. My guess is that there's clearly effects. So we've had cases of patients dying from pneumonitis, which is basically lung inflammation from vaping. I would guess that the chemicals in the vaporizers definitely have some negative effects. Nicotine can have some blood vessel constricting effects, but they're very temporary. And there's not great data to suggest that nicotine by itself is actually bad for you. It's really the smoke
Yeah.
from the tobacco that's the problem. And I think you ask any pulmonologist out there, they're going to tell you that vaping's terrible for you, even though we don't have amazing data on it yet. Give it a few years.
Right. Yeah. It's just such a new thing. Like I said, it just blows me away that it's as popular as it is. Because again, it's like I'm out of that element, but I have one college student and two high school kids. They're like, you wouldn't believe how many kids are vaping. I'm like, oh, that's not good to hear. So I didn't mean to go down a rabbit hole, but I was just curious. So I'll get us back on track. But
Not a fan of vaping. Yeah.
no, I don't think many health professionals are, but and the problem with it is it's a lot easier to hide than
Oh
smoking.
yeah.
You just
Yeah.
don't smell it. It's harder to see. So, all right, let's talk about nutrition, which I know is not your favorite topic. So I'll just ask you a really vague question about it because like I'm a dietitian, but sometimes I can always tell like when a family member or friend is going to ask me something nutrition, feel like, so what do you think? And it's like, I know the question's coming, but I just find with nutrition, there's very, very little things. There are very few topics that are actually black and white for people. It's like, it's so gray. And people
Mhm.
will send me an email or they'll send me a DM on Instagram or whatever it is, or I'll do like a Q&A session. And sometimes these questions, people are expecting a yes or no, but it's like a 15-minute answer just because it's so gray.
Yep.
But I just want to ask one question because this would be a whole nother hour, but what is the one thing about nutrition that you wish more people understood? And we just talked about blood pressure and how it's not just salt intake and not sodium intake. And in fact, a lot of people, when they go on a more natural foods diet or a ketogenic or paleo diet, they're not taking in much sodium. And it's really important to actually add salt back into that. But what is one thing about nutrition that you wish more people understood? And we'll just leave it at that.
That's oh man, that's a tough one. So nutrition is a challenge, not because I don't like it, but because people are so opinionated about it,
Yeah,
right? I mean,
yes, for
like,
sure.
you make a statement and people act like you killed their dog. It's insane.
Right.
And beyond that is, I can't think of anything that is really more personalized in medicine than like,
Yeah.
what nutrition is going to work best for somebody. And even, doing this now for 4 years and, telling, this person over here, they need to be a vegan, and this person over here, they need to be keto and eat nothing but animal products. And then I've got another person over here who's a carnivore diet. I mean, like just the idea that there's one answer is ridiculous. But anyway, if there's one thing that I want everybody to know about nutrition is, I guess that I would probably say the dose makes the poison. So we've got this like saying in toxicology and medicine that the dose makes the poison, and that basically means that anything at a certain dose can be a poison, and just about anything at a certain dose is not a poison, right? So the opposite is true as well, and I think people kind of forget that about nutrition, and they let it become this like overarching thing for them, right? Like I mean, if I could say, I mean, I'd love to be able to actually say sugar is a poison, but in reality, it's not a poison. There's fructose in healthy foods out there. There's glucose in healthy foods out there. It's just at lower doses than we're used to normally eating it. So I guess what I'm getting at is I think that if everyone could just eat whole foods and have moderation to their diet, then almost all of our problems would be fixed, right? And that's that concept that a little bit here and there is not going to actually hurt you. I think is something that people forget, and they vilify certain they vilify certain vegetables because of some of the oils that they have in them, or they vilify saturated fat because in some people it can cause elevated lipids and lead to cardiovascular disease. You vilify all these things, and then you're left with like, well, what can I eat? I mean,
Right.
if I actually like read every article and took that to the heart from every single like research paper out there, then I wouldn't be able to eat anything. Like I would literally be eating like dietary fiber. you know it's like the only thing
But
that
some
people
people
say.
say that
That's,
is
yeah, you're right, that
mental
too.
too. So I don't even think you could say that.
It's
Right.
just this.
We could say it about water. Like,
Oh
that
yeah.
dose makes a poison. Like you overdo water, you could have a hypernatremia.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
just,
you can die from drinking too much water. Like
uh,
literally anything could kill you at a high enough concentration, just like anything would not kill you if it's at a low enough concentration. So, the what I try to at least what I try to do in my life, what I try to impart on my clients and my patients and my family and friends is that, just moderation is extremely important. And that doesn't mean that's going to solve all your problems, but it's going to prevent a lot of them.
right. And I know for my clients, a lot of them are very metabolically ill. Probably yours are as well. And I usually talk with them and say, you know what, moderation sometimes is a very tricky road to go down because you just don't, what's moderate for you is completely different of what's moderate for the next person. So yeah, we might need to limit some foods for you, or at least some of the dosages of different foods or how much you're eating, because you're very ill right now. And if you want your body to heal, you got to take those out of the equation and let that healing occur. But that doesn't mean that a year from now, when you're basically a different person because you put different fuel in your body, that we can't re-examine and alter some things at that point. So I know,
And
and
we'll get
I think so many people like start something and it works, and they just think that they're going to do that for the rest of their life.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going through this right now, actually, with my mom, who just lost like 80 pounds. And, she's the type of person, and a lot of people are like this. In fact, I was like this. I actually, when I was in my early 20s, I lost close to 95 pounds.
Oh,
And I was one of those people, and I probably got it from her, that like, I, there was no moderation. I had to just completely eliminate things from the
yeah,
diet
yeah,
in order to actually see the weight loss that I wanted. And she's the same way. But now we're kind of going through this process of like, okay, now it's time to open things back up. Like, you got to get back to living your life. You got to find a way, because the risk that we run is if people continue down that road for too long, then I think it is that much harder to stay on that particular diet for that period of time. It's the whole concept of like, are you going to be in like, extensive ketosis for the rest of your life? Are you going to live socially? Are you going to live at, 90% fat for the rest of your life? And that's really hard to do. So at
right.
some point we have to, help people through, to this level of moderation that's a healthy dose of these things, so that they can live in society and be happy, and not, have to focus on their diet so much, because that's ultimately what we want. We want them to be happy and healthy, and not even realizing that they're having to do anything to be that way.
Right. And I find that to be true most often with carbohydrates. Like somebody's coming to me with type 2 diabetes that they've had for 10 or 20 years. Well, I'm going to recommend that you go under 50 grams of carbohydrates for a while, because you are not processing those efficiently at all. And then after 3 to 6 months, we can re-examine that, see how you're doing, and maybe we can alter that. Maybe we can do more like 100. But it depends on, yeah, where you're at, what your disease process is, what your medical history is, what your family history is. There's so many factors. And like you said, activity plays a big role as well. So I have been seeing a lot of children developing insulin resistance as well, which is so sad and disheartening, because honestly, there shouldn't be any children with type 2 diabetes. I mean, obviously, we have the type 1 where something just goes awry with the pancreas, but type 2, it's running rampant. It's growing like crazy, obesity and insulin resistance. So do you have like one tip that you can offer parents? I know there's a lot of parents listening to this podcast as well. And I know, this isn't a podcast specializing with kids, but I know you have children. I have teenagers. So that in and of itself is a little bit trickier because like my kids drive now. I don't always have control over what they're doing and what they're eating. And, it's like, I don't want to think that maybe they went through a drive-through that I'm not aware of, but it's just how it is. And like you said, you have to be able to live in today's world. And I feel like as a parent, like my job is to educate you, provide you with the nutrition that I think will help you grow and thrive while you're in my house. And then when you leave, then you're on your own. And hopefully I've taught you the principles for you to be healthy and metabolically fit. But do you have like a tip for parents to help move their children away from that insulin resistance and hopefully set them up to prevent these awful diseases that come along with insulin resistance?
Such a tough area. I mean, I think just in general, probably the most, like you said it already, but I'll just reiterate what you said, and that's that the most important thing we can do is educate our children. They're not getting nutritional education in school, and you cannot assume that society is going to appropriately educate them on nutrition. So it's our job to put healthy food in front of them when they're a child, when they're young, whether they deny it or eat it
Right.
is one story, but getting it in front of them so that they realize they have an idea of what healthy is, and then also educate them as to why this is healthy, why this is unhealthy, how this is going to make them feel, helping them understand like what that feeling is inside their body when they get the dopamine hit from the sugar, like help them understand that that's addictive, that's a chemical process that's happening inside your body. That I think that's important. But ultimately they're going to go out into the world and make their own decisions. So the more we can empower them with education and knowledge, the better decisions they'll make. In terms of kids who are already showing some signs of insulin resistance, there's the most important thing is diet and exercise. I mean, I think that is the crux of the matter, right? The reason most kids can have a relatively crappy diet and not show insulin resistance is because they're running their heads off. They're running around the house, they're exercising, they are using up all of the sugar that they're putting into their body. Now, over time, over the last 30, 40 years, what we've seen is kids are less active, and there's just more fructose. It's everywhere you look, right? There's fructose in every single drink out there. There's fructose and processed oils in every single packaged food you can buy at the grocery store, and that's adding up. And because our children are less active and they're eating more crap, then we're seeing insulin resistance happen early and earlier in our current population. So if I could impart anything, it would be move away from processed foods as much as possible, move back to whole foods. That includes like less sugary drinks is a huge one. Kids love sugary drinks, and those are just full of high fructose corn syrup, which is going to cause the fatty liver and the insulin resistance and all that stuff. And then try to get them outside as much as you can so that they're being active and they're running off those carbohydrates. But I struggle against I struggle with the idea of significantly limiting foods with kids, because then I think we really run a dangerous risk of creating eating disorders, and we certainly don't want to do that because there's enough mental health issue in our country currently. So I think just trying to impart moderation, put healthy foods in front of them, let them eat all the things, but as much as possible, getting the whole foods as opposed to the processed foods, and then kicking them outside instead of letting them watch TV.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's such a fine line there. Like I try, like sometimes I know in my head, like I'm being crazy mom about the nutrition thing. And, just no soda in the house. Not, none of this, or I'll say like, oh, that has food dyes in it. 'Cause one of my kids gets headaches every time he has red food coloring. And it's like, you don't want to be the crazy mom, but yet so much that
I
there's
know.
a fine line. So yeah, I agree with you. Like do the best that you can in your house under your control. And then they're not always going to be under your control, and let them make the choices outside. But there's also so much peer pressure with kids too. And especially when they get to their teenage years, it's like my kids will want to have friends over, but they feel like they have to go to the convenience store or the grocery store to get good snacks because we don't have any good snacks in the house, Mom. Nobody wants to eat nuts and cheese and beef jerky and fruit. And I'm like, well, how do you know that? They just don't. Like, they want Dorito, oh, I shouldn't say name brands, but chips and whatever else. But there's a lot of peer pressure. And I think more so with boys is what I see. But yeah, hopefully we'll start to just be knowledgeable enough to start moving them away from that. And I always tell parents, just if anything else, just give them 3 meals a day and try to wipe out the snacks and the sugary drinks in between meals as much as possible. And that will definitely be helpful. All right. Well, one more question and then we'll wrap up. You can let us know where to find you. But I saw on your website, and I know we have a lot of health-minded people in this space. And a lot of times people are kind of like you and I. It's like once they start learning, they just want to teach other people, or they want to know where they can, like I've had people ask me, well, how can I learn what you learn? I want to teach what you teach. And I'm like, I learned it all on my own. Like, I had to basically reteach myself through podcasts. And there was some courses I went through, like the low carb with Diet Doctor. And there's actually now a holistic dietitian. I can't remember exactly what the credential was, but I just found that recently. And I was like, wow, that's because people are asking for this
Cool.
integrative dietetics. But I saw that you have like a medicine, like a fellowship or a course that people can go through. Tell us a little bit about that and where we can find out more if we want to go through Wild Health and get some testing done.
Yeah, so I mean, wildhealth.com is the place to go for all the things you might be interested in. You can that links to our podcast if people are interested in hearing more about, sort of things we talk about, which are generally pretty nerdy. Or
I love nerdy stuff.
the fellowship is there as well. And then, of course, if people want to sign up as a patient, they can go to wildhealth.com as well. The fellowship is sort of, along the lines of our idea that basically, like, we truly want to, like, change the way medicine is practiced, and we can't do that just by ourselves. Nor do I plan to see all the patients in the United States. There's there, at some point you have to be able to educate other physicians in this stuff. And when Matt and I realized that how powerful this was, we also realized that, like, nobody is getting this education. Like, this isn't happening in medical school. Nobody's talking about precision genomics. So we started a fellowship, and we have about 100 fellows a year go through. It's a combination of health coaches and physicians. We've got some chiropractors, we've got dentists, we've got like people from all walks of life who are interested in this stuff. And some people, it's really just people who just kind of want to learn more. And they can do that either through, an online year-long fellowship, or they can do kind of like an asynchronous fellowship as well. So, for the year-long one, we have like weekly meetings with the webinar and, sample patients and things like that. And then there's an asynchronous one, which is mostly just like the education materials, the lectures and things like that. But there's, I don't know, like 100 hours of, or I think more than that actually, of lecture series and content and modules that people go through to learn all about precision medicine. And we teach about genomics and sort of like more of a functional medicine approach and root cause analysis and things like that. So that's the fellowship. And then, of course, if people are interested in learning more about being a patient, the podcast is a good way to kind of like get a better understanding of like our approach. Although I think we've gone over kind of a bit here. And then there's also, just the podcast if you want to learn more about precision genomics in general.
Excellent. Well, we will make sure to link all of that information in the show notes. And if you want to go and get some testing done, make sure to visit wildhealth.com and get yourself hooked in with the team over there. They're very knowledgeable and have a very comprehensive approach. So we thank you so much for your time and starting this awesome company and putting out so much information in your podcast. It's a great one to binge listen to because there's well over 250 episodes there. So there's a lot of information and a lot of different avenues and just so many topics there to learn about. So thank you for all that you do and for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.